My name is Bill Maurer. I'm the Dean of Social Sciences, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to this, our third Zeries session, where we are spotlighting some of the work of people in the School of Social Sciences related to COVID-19 and the current pandemic. This is our third. Our first talk was on kind of public health and social science context. The second talk was around Chinese social media during the pandemic. And today for our third talk, we have Professor Graeme Boushey from the Department of Political Science. And Graeme was going to be teaching a course this spring that he'll say a little bit about in a minute in public policy, but then kind of pivoted and readjusted his class to make it around politics and policy of COVID-19. Professor Boushey is an expert in public policy at the state and federal level. He's the author of a book called Policy Diffusion Dynamics in America. And in addition to being a professor in the political science department, he also has been the co-director of the Center for the Study of Democracy. And Professor Boushey, I'm really glad you could join us here and tell us a little bit about what you originally intended to teach and then how you sort of changed it up given our current situation. So I should note that we are recording this session. It will be up and available for other folks to view on the Social Sciences website later. And if you'd like to pose a question at any point during today's discussion, if you go to the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a little Q&A thing, a little Q&A icon with two speech bubbles. Just click in that and type your question there. And I'll be getting to questions as I'm able throughout today's discussion. So with that, Graeme, go ahead.
Thanks, Bill. First, just thank you so much for having me. And I'm not sure if the Zoom audience can tell, but I'm on my porch on a nice sunny day in Irvine. This is where I've discovered I can work. The upsides of this is it's a private place. The downsides are that my children may lock me out on this porch during the talk, which will mean they're not here, which is okay. And also that it's garbage day. So you may hear a truck rumbling through to gather materials through this lecture. One of the things I want to say at the outset of this talk is appreciation to Bill for leading us through this time, but also to University of California, Irvine. One of the things I've been doing in this class is talking to professors at other universities, University of Oklahoma, University of Texas. They've joined us in our classes. And one of the things they've raised is how impressed they are with the ability of the University of California system to respond to the crisis, how quickly we were able to move on to this new form of teaching. So thanks for joining me, and thanks to students and faculty for being good sports about this, this unusual disruption. So Bill asked me a question, to discuss the origins of this talk. And so I shared a very brief PowerPoint to talk about how it is that I decided to come up with this class. And let me go ahead and share this with the audience. Like many of you, I've found myself as much as 2 months ago consuming a lot of research and popular media on the coronavirus epidemic. And at the time, I had been slated to teach a class on contemporary theories and challenges in American public policy, which is a class where we review ways that public policy scholars like myself have tried to make sense of the policy process, how problems are recognized, how solutions are developed, how they're implemented, and how we explain these against the backdrop of contemporary American politics. But at the time I was doing this, I started to realize that the coronavirus was going to become sort of a critical case for thinking about policymaking and democracy. And at the same time, much of my usual reading material was disappearing. I'd actually tried to avoid reading about the political moment by listening to soccer podcasts and reading about sports, and that's no longer as available. So I had to find a way to channel my energy as a teacher and a researcher. And I started to think about the coronavirus as a stress test for democracy. One of the things, we hear about from economists are concerns when markets are no longer functioning as expected and when markets start to fail. And the coronavirus in many ways is so sweeping and revealing such a diverse array of problems in American politics, and unfortunately very complex problems with complex sources and hopefully resolvable solutions. But there's such complexity here that I started toying with this notion of organizing a class around coronavirus as a stress test for democracy. And there's some motivating quotes that I really enjoyed, one from a tweeter and historian who pointed out that, you know, we've experienced part of the coronavirus epidemic before, just never at once. It's like the Spanish flu of 1918, the stock market crash of 1929, but overseen by President Hardin's total incompetence plus Nixon's pettiness and paranoia. So, you know, we certainly have an intersection of a president who's struggling to manage a once in a generation crisis. Others have observed that, you know, the coronavirus really is a stress test. It's not the coronavirus that itself is breaking America, but it reveals what's already been broken. Now, I want to, you know, tell you at the outset that these are meant to be provocative claims offered by people in the popular media. But as an academic, one of the things we want to do is, you know, apply research, look to academic knowledge, and evaluate with a critical eye whether such alarmist quotes are true, to what extent they hold, and how we can make sense of many of the concerns that people in the public sphere have about something like the coronavirus epidemic. So as I develop the course, for those of you especially who are students or from the broader community, I want to explain what we're trying to do. The first was to use coronavirus as the case in the class. So I wanted to explore how classic theories of public policy and political science help us understand the challenges government faces in responding adequately to a crisis as large as this pandemic. And so in this regard, we're reading classic theories of policy that I'd already placed on my syllabus, but using coronavirus as the illustrative case. What does it teach us? How does it show what we have right? And how does it show what we have wrong? One of the joys of teaching this class has been that I've been inviting very prominent researchers to come in and join the class discussions. And one of the things we ask them is, how do they think about what coronavirus suggests for their research? So yes, this week we had one of the most prominent public policy scholars in the country join my class, a man named Brian Jones, who, you know, this week was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And what he shared with the students was in many ways what coronavirus showed that he had wrong in his theories, how he's going to adapt his theories about crisis events and policy change to account for such disruptive and widely, you know, extensive challenges to our political system. So it's been really rewarding, I think, for students as well as for me as a researcher, to see how people who've tried to explain the policy in America are wrestling with and drawing insights with the crisis in real time. As importantly, one of the things I've been trying to do for our students is illustrate how people in the public sphere are struggling with questions that we think a lot about as social scientists. So one of the things you'll see as we walk through this presentation is I've noticed that, you know, academics may have written about these things for a long time, but journalists and pundits and people writing letters to the editor are talking about things that we study, you know, problems of collective action, what we call the paradox of preparedness in a pandemic, the idea that if you prepare well, it'll all seem like all the preparations were for naught because the event never occurred, and what we can learn about how challenging these types of things are, and point to my students that social science really is alive right now. It's not just those of us in the classrooms who are thinking through these issues. We have politicians, academics, and members of the public wrestling through trade-offs between opening businesses early to stimulate the economy versus the need to continue to flatten the curve and protect public health. Well, it's just that we're having social sciences alive at this moment, and it's been really wonderful to show students this through discussions of contemporary media coverage of the event. And finally, the goal is to use real-world examples from this crisis to illustrate and test theories of public policy. To that end, I've hoped to turn my students into real-time researchers. And if nothing else, what we're going to try to do in this class, and I should explain, this is a graduate class. It's a mix of PhD students in social science and MPP students in the policy program at UCI. if nothing else, what I hope to get out of this class is a research agenda. We're watching something unfold in real time, and it's often very distressing. But by looking at it with, perhaps a more clinical or academic eye, we can get a little bit of distance from it and also start to generate questions for the future, questions that we're going to be trying to answer for years to come, decades to come about this moment. So the course deliverables for the students have been to develop a research agenda for how we study the politics of COVID-19 with their area of expertise and knowledge, for them to develop synthetic reviews and illustrative case studies that document how COVID helps us illustrate theories of American public policy, and to collect data from the current response to test existing theories. And this has been really rewarding. This week, students submitted their research proposals, and as a scholar of public policy process theory, I'm a generalist. I study how the sausage is made, but my students are often experts. And so I have one student studying, SNAP programs at the state level, how states are responding to new demands for food assistance and food insecurity by trying to modify state level programs that are federally supported, and what states are going to be more dynamic and adaptive at delivering food stamps and nutritional assistance to the poor than others. I have another student working on domestic violence policy and how local governments are trying to moderate and work with sheriff's departments and other law enforcement agencies to develop outreach strategies when a shelter-in-place order is exposing victims of domestic violence to longer and more insufferable containment with their abusers. So how are they responding? I have a really wonderful student who currently works for Weed Maps, works for the cannabis industry, and has been explaining to me that the challenges which are already in place for small businesses with coronavirus are amplified by the specific nuances of this industry, where they're not eligible for small government loans because they can't have any federal funding or assistance whatsoever. So I have students across the map doing research on diverse topics, and it's really exciting. So I can't wait to see where they come from. As a researcher, what it tells me is that the unique dimensions of this crisis. It's not narrowly focused. It's diverse and sweeping and affecting all of these different areas of policy that we usually hold as distinct. To give you an idea, and then I will happily turn it over to people for questions, or I can walk you through some of my teaching. I'll share with you how I've organized the class. And Bill, you'll notice that I've 12 weeks of reading for a 10-week quarter. That's not preparing for a move to the semester system, I promise you. It's simply that I was so excited that I decided I would generate the topics I'd like to work on and have the students choose what they wanted to read. So the categories here in blue are what we've actually worked on as a class. And then you can see how I tried to organize a broader class. So in the first week, we talk about the idea of coronavirus as a stress test for democracy, how sweeping it is. We have Rick Hasson in the law school writing about the reforms that need to be undertaken just so we can have elections during a pandemic. We have a man named Norm Ornstein writing about how Congress needs to develop procedures for voting from quarantine. We have, people who are newly both unemployed and off insurance because much of their insurance was provided through private insurance markets. So we talk about how sweeping the problem is as a way of scoping the class. And then we move through these topics. We talk about what I call the paradox of preparation, which is the challenges a political system like ours faced in maintaining expensive programs for rare events. Rare events that, if we do our job, never materialize. And how it is that short-term political incentives for elected officials can undermine the efforts to manage long-term preparedness for crisis events, especially rare event crisis events. The next set of classes moves to how we evaluate information processing. You can see here President Trump's famous quote, "I felt it was a pandemic long before it was a pandemic." And if that's the case, then why does it feel like our response has been so haphazard and devolved to the state level? So you can look through these topics and get a sense of how I'm seeing the class moving from how we identify, define problems, how critical events lead to policy change in the American context, how Congress functions under crisis, how presidents typically respond in a crisis and how other presidents may have handled the crisis, the implications of the crisis for federalism, what I call how we respond to the infodemic, the impact of misinformation on policymaking in the public response, the question of social susceptibility, how inequalities that already existed in America exacerbate our ability to respond to the crisis and made our particular system of government especially susceptible to this crisis, and what happens when a public who typically don't realize what government is providing for them are prevented with a real case of government failure, how that changes opinion, how it shapes their opinions of government. So we're tackling a broad range of issues, but I think a really rewarding one, at least through the first 4 weeks of the class. Now, before I open it up to your questions, and I can certainly walk you through parts of this presentation, but I'll leave this topics up in case there are questions coming in right now, I want to give you a few caveats. The first is, one of the joys of being a professor is the ability to learn new things, right? I've been a middle school teacher and I love teaching. The added bonus of being a research professor is I don't always have to teach the same material year in and year out. And in fact, I get to ask new questions and choose readings that I find challenging or engaging. But the caveat is many of the topics here are things that I'm working through, right? So unlike a research talk, I don't have the definitive answers for these topics. And also some of these readings haven't occurred yet, right? We're looking forward. So many of the questions we'll be wrestling through, I haven't had a chance to discuss with my students, and so we don't have coherent answers. But with that uncertainty in mind, I'd be absolutely delighted for those of you who have questions both about how I'm approaching teaching in this moment, why it is that I embarked on teaching a special topics class like this, but also those of you who may have questions about the substantive questions I've raised about COVID-19. So Bill, I will turn it over in case there are questions, and then otherwise I can talk about some cases.
Great. No, thank you so much, Graeme. There is a question that just came in, but I did want to let people know again, if you've never done this before, on the bottom of your Zoom window, there's two little speech bubbles that says Q&A. You can click on that and then post a question right there, and I will try to keep up and read these off to Professor Boushey. And the first one that's come in from Joshua here is about the relationship between COVID-19 and what many had thought was going to be an economic recession anyway, and the extent to which, COVID-19 in some ways, right now is precipitating a recession, but maybe Joshua is suggesting is like sort of the scapegoat for a recession that was going to happen anyway. So it's really about that relationship between the pandemic and the lockdown's effects and the economic consequences.
I mean, that's a fascinating question, and very hard to parse out whether the recession was going to occur in the summer. And we see lots of places where we see this intersection of a desire to maintain a healthy economy against the added pain of the public health measures that we've needed to enact to protect population health. So, in some ways we have this paradox of preparation, right? Where we had a government that needed to prevent this unlikely event or face a severe cost. But the interesting thing about this is that we have a political system that rewards short-term incentives, right? And that's not unique to Trump. We have a president who's facing re-election in 4 years and who knows that economic stability, economic growth is his best argument for re-election. And he's suddenly faced with a pandemic that no one can control, right? You can control it with good government policy, but he didn't cause coronavirus to emerge in Wuhan. His response has been very problematic. But one of the interesting themes we talked about in this class on the paradox of preparation is a question of prospect theory, how people operate under conditions of threat and risk, and how people operate when they think times are good. And one of the concerns is that President Trump may be increasingly acceptant of public health risks if he thinks that he can gamble, right? And this is the same for governors who are facing re-election. There's a concern that there's an incentive to gamble, reopen the economy early in the hopes that you will trigger economic stabilization and growth, and that some of our policymakers who have these short-term incentives may be acceptant of that risk as a Hail Mary, right? The further down the economy grows, the lower the public opinion support is for the administration, the more accepting they are of taking a bad risk, a risky bet that you can stimulate the economy by reopening the economy and hope that the COVID epidemic dies down in the summer. So you had also raised a question, Joshua, about whether or not this is going to be a useful scapegoat. And to this, I'll just express my skepticism. It may be that their actors are going to try to point to the coronavirus to avoid responsibility. And that certainly seems to explain, to the extent that we can, and it's very difficult, explain the president's response to this, the president's insistence that we devolve policymaking to the states during a crisis. But one common explanation is that the president is going to try to deflect responsibility for the economic cost by explaining that it was the governors and mayors that led this decision rather than himself, and that he's really in charge of delivering and controlling the bailout that'll lead us out of the way. So Joshua, I appreciate your question because it speaks to some of the ways that we're trying to think about how the strategic and political incentives of our elected officials may be exacerbating our ability to get out of a very, very bad crisis. And thanks.
Thanks. And there's a bunch of questions coming in, so I'll try to group them and keep up. And I apologize if I don't get to everyone. But there's one here, Graeme, from our colleague Jim Danziger, who says, long ago, Jack Walker argued that states were a source of innovation as they respond differently to a policy issue in the US federal system. Will this be a theme in your approach in your class?
Yes, we're going to get that, Jim. You'll see in week 8, pandemics in the laboratories of democracy. And, you know, I'm especially excited for this week of reading, not only because this is my area of research, but the book I wrote borrowed from epidemiology to argue that we had policy outbreaks, that policy diffusion followed patterns that were familiar to public health scholars. So I'm completely invested in this area of research. And there's been some very early work already showing differences in state policy making and showing how networks of states, so ideologically linked states, blue states, democratic states, were earlier to take measures to lock down the economy. We can model this at the daily, weekly, and monthly level. And the question is, will they continue to innovate? I dare say they will, because we have something which I think is terribly unusual. When I said I think the political system is not functioning as expected, I very much mean federalism here is not functioning as expected. We would have expected the presidential administration to take a very aggressive role in coordinating our response, and instead they've devolved it to the states. When you do that, you cultivate experimentation. You cultivate state policy responses. As my students are studying state experiments with feeding the poor in a public emergency, state experiments with providing healthcare, but also state experiments for public health measures to lock down in response to the pandemic and reopen. So there's going to be a real wealth of research questions raised by this and a real diversity of state policy responses. But Jim, I want to tell you one other thing I think is very interesting, which is the federal system, and Walker talks about states as pioneers, states as driving policy. That is true, but in a crisis like this, there's a cost. There's a cost to the delay as states first wait for federal action, and then those states that have the slack resources, the wealth, the wherewithal to innovate, begin to do so. So California and New York, they're faced with the crisis. They're, gateway states for international trade and migration. But when the coronavirus hits, their initial response is to wait for federal action. And we see this in other public health measures. When it doesn't come, the states that can are going to be those that take on the responses and experiment with the appropriate solutions. In our typical models of federalism, smaller, less professional state governments like the South Dakotas and Idahos of the world wait to see what works and then strategically borrow what does. Now, the concern here is that the delay between federal action and the first state's pioneering response has a cost. And in this case, the cost is very easily measurable. It's a cost in additional outbreak of the disease and human lives. We're passing 50,000 coronavirus deaths today. So the failure of the federal system to coordinate is going to be one story, and the pioneering solutions developed by our state governments is the other. I guess we're all hoping now that federalism, at least through state invention, is going to provide our path out of this.
Thanks. And a related question, and this is coming in from Jeff Minhas. Hi, Jeff. Is do you think there are any changes or corrections or shifts in the way our government is structured that can be put in place to better prepare for the next thing, the next big, huge crisis? Like what are we learning now that can help us adjust the way our system works?
I mean, this is one of the remarkable stories of coronavirus. And if you guys want just a really wonderful read, and I can maybe when we post this video also provide some of the readings I talk about, you can look at a book by Michael Lewis, the author of Moneyball, who wrote a book called The Fifth Risk. And Michael Lewis got very interested in what was the chaotic Trump transition as Trump took control of the administration, and then the administration's approach to managing public programs. And the reason, and you don't need to buy the book, he's actually explained this across a series of articles in Vanity Fair and other publications. But the reason why it's such a remarkable story is it highlights the many programs we had to manage and prevent the severity of a pandemic like this one. So I will answer your question about how we can look forward in a second, but what I want to say is, in 2006, George W. Bush, under the Department of Homeland Security, revises the nation's pandemic preparedness plan. In 2014, Barack Obama does the same. And it's not just within single agencies that we have pandemic preparedness, multiple agencies. We have redundancies in the State Department, in Defense, in the CDC, and actually several other agencies, all of which had shelled out very, very good pandemic preparedness plans. If you had looked at the United States and public health rankings across the world, we were the strongest. We were the system ranked most able to survive a crisis like this one. And yet, despite all of those many advantages, we've had what I really believe is a failure, a policy failure. And so that's one of the themes that we really unpacked in the early weeks of this class, which is given not only the broad preparedness, but then the flow of information across agencies, people from the VA, the CDC, the State Department, Defense, screaming, our very own Peter Navarro, an economic advisor for the Trump administration, writing a memo in January about the, impact of this pandemic on the economy and on public health. The system was screaming. Right, the alarm bells were going off, and in week 3 of my class, I had an expert on the bureaucracy come on, and he had described, the role of the bureaucracy as being the canaries in the coal mine. Congress creates diversity in the bureaucracy and competition among different agencies, in part because Congress wants to cultivate good information. Congress purposely creates redundancy in the ability of our bureaucracy to sound the alarm. So rather than depending on a single agency, Congress strategically gives different bureaucracies the power to identify problems. And it was working. So then what explains the failure? And it turns out that in theory, the people I was reading didn't have a good place for the office of the White House. We think that the White House amplifies these concerns. The White House might be the switchboard operator to turn on the alarm bells ringing from different agencies. But what happens when the office of the White House chooses not to respond to these concerns, chooses not to mobilize as early as they could have? So you'd ask what structural reforms we need. On the one hand, the lessons are going to be drawn that we had all of the assets in place to be aware of this pandemic. I read a remarkable story where I think it was the State Department or the CDC, I forget which agency, had a team on the ground positioned and instructed to detect coronavirus in Wuhan that was closed months ago, right? It was closed in the late years of 2019, I believe. We'll have to go and double check that. So we had all of these agents in the field who were out there to detect the problems, but we had a failure of coordination at the top. What reforms might better resolve this, I think we're going to see reorganization in the office of the White House. We're going to see cabinet level attention given to crises like these, and we may see Congress reasserting a role in driving a response. Because as much as I've been critical of the presidential administration, we also had a Congress that was failing to amplify the crisis we were facing. So we'll see. I'm sorry I'm not answering your question well, but part of it is that we had all the assets in place. We'll see a reshuffling, but this may be a situation where leadership mattered, and people will be writing counterfactuals about what could have happened under different administrations for years to come.
Thanks. Yeah, no, a lot of this is just going to play out, right? And we'll see what kind of changes get proposed and what actually takes root. So there's a couple of clusters of questions here, and I'll tell you what they are, Graeme, and you can maybe start with one or the other. The first is Fadla here has been very patiently waiting for an answer to one of the first questions posed, which is about changes to any prospect for changes to the laws or the rules around the 2020 election, right? And I know Congress is having this debate now about whether they can vote in absentia and all that. Fadla also wants to join your class and is an undergrad. It might be too late because we're entering week 5. But so there's that question and others like it around policies having to do with elections. And then there's another set of questions that have come in from people like Diane and Gustavo and others about kind of a comparative perspective, cross-national, not cross-state, but cross-national. So I'll let you pick up those two sets.
Okay. So, to the question of elections, again, to go back to one of the quotes I had when I, started organizing this class about how coronavirus didn't cause what's broken in America, it revealed what's broken in America, and it's putting it under additional stress. Our fragmented electoral system, where states control rules for elections, is certainly an excellent example of this. And I would encourage you to follow UCI's Rick Hasson on Twitter. In early March, Rick Hasson, an affiliate of the Center for the Study of Democracy and one of the real lights at UCI, he's just a real intellectual and a real leader on this issue, organized a topic on the, U.S. election 2020. Can democracy survive the 2020 election? Because of the way that the franchise itself has become a political football, right? The efforts, the concern that the right to vote in our democracy is now, a contested question among political actors. And, what the coronavirus has done is reveal how, first of all, it's revealed the barriers that many states have placed on people who wish to vote. And there's reasons that people argue that we should have these barriers like voter ID laws, but consider the coronavirus epidemic where the DMVs are closed, right? People can't go to the DMV and get a driver's license in order to vote because the DMVs are closed and they're being told to stay home, right? And unfortunately, there's this notion that solutions like vote by mail are somehow advantageous to the challenging party, right, for the presidential election. So the Democrats will benefit if we have national vote by mail. Now, the fun thing about this is that in teaching a class like this, social science is reacting in real time. And we have people doing research and calling attention to research that shows that parties don't really seem to benefit from vote by mail, right? When the states that have unrolled vote by mail initiatives don't seem to benefit Republicans or Democrats either way. It's just a way to get ballots in the hands of people more conveniently. But we certainly face a crisis. And the crisis we face is one of the legitimacy of the 2020 election. If we are having lockdowns, if people feel as though their health is threatened as they try to participate in the election, the legitimacy of the election itself is going to be in question. Sorry, I certainly hope that's just a frog in my throat. On the other hand, if we undertake the reforms that we need to ensure people have access to the vote, it's fairly clear that many actors, not least of which include the President of the United States of America, are going to argue that those reforms themselves led to widespread irregularities in voting and question legitimacy of elections. So like I said, these were themes that were already unfolding, but COVID has revealed how high the stakes are. Bill, you may have to answer the next question here. I'm not sure.
I don't have an answer for the next question, but it's about the comparative
you're right.
perspective. And I guess first, are you doing any of that in the class? It sounded like most of the students' projects were more U.S. or state policy focused, not cross-national. And then also, like, what are your thoughts on those sort of cross-national comparisons? A lot of people talk about, the U.S. I'm giving you a chance here to recover your voice. A lot of people are making comparisons between the US and Germany right now, for instance, or between the UK, what's been happening in the UK, and what's been happening in Sweden, which are two places that didn't lock down, but are having very different outcomes based on other things having to do with the way that those governments manage this pandemic.
So if I were adding weeks to this 12-week class in a 10-week quarter, I would include weeks on, comparative policy process theory. And what we use it for in this class, we use these discussions as, counterfactual exercises. How does the US compare? How might processes have unfolded? Why are things unfolding differently? I have readings throughout the syllabus that bring in international perspectives. My co-director, Sarah Goodman, would probably have told me about 5 times by now that the US has a lot to learn about, crisis in democracy and populism from other countries in the world. And so when we read about, for example, the presidency, we read about lessons from other countries and how they've, what caused the rise of populist executives in those countries and what's led to the path following those populist presidents. I have a reading about, it was very distressing to see it, but it referred to, the reading was called The Leader of the Free World Speaks, and it was about Angela Merkel's response to coronavirus. So we think a lot about, what this crisis says for the US's position in the world, how it's hurting, the US's legitimacy as a world leader, how we're foregoing many of the advantages we had as a leader in policy and a leader in democratic norms in the world. And yes, we are thinking and talking about how different countries have handled these crises with competing measures. But I must say, in a class like this, you end up myopically focused on what you know best. And for me, the case I'm reading about most is the US. So I'd be happy to answer specific questions about the comparative perspective, but it hasn't been a central theme to these readings. And it should be. You're completely right to ask.
Well, that's the next class. And then you can let in, you can then accommodate Fadla so that they can enter the class. Okay.
No, but I've been thinking, I've been genuinely thinking that I might be teaching the politics of COVID online well into the winter of next year, and I sincerely hope I'm not. Let's root for this to be a one-off seminar.
So there's another question. This is from another Joshua. Who points out, we've been through a bunch of once in a generation, like crises and stress tests, like 9/11, the Great Recession, the election of Trump, some would say. And so the question he poses is, how will American democracy survive or adapt to the growing norm of crises? Right? Like if you have a crisis every 5 years, then does it make sense to call it a crisis anymore? Or is it just the norm? And how will or should American democracy survive or adapt?
So first, if you study political institutions, you'd see extraordinary cause for concern, right? This question is rooted in academic research about the instability of presidential systems like the one we have in the United States that have been explored by comparativists and by American politics scholars for a very long time. And the concern that's emerging is that our political system gives extraordinary power to the minority party when it's out of power to block and create gridlock, and extraordinary power and incentives for that party to then push through their agendas when they have the rare moments of unified control. And that leads to instability because we do feel like we are unable to make modest policy adjustments to policy problems as they come and seem to be cycling haphazardly from one crisis to the next. So we have a political system that seems, when compared to some others, to be especially prone to this type of instability, especially when it's given the type of polarized politics with minority veto powers that we have in a system like ours. Now, I could talk a lot about how concerned I am with our political institutions and whether this new normal can endure. And I'd like to add to this that I'm, as a scholar of federalism, getting questions from friends of mine and people that I've never thought I would hear, which ask about what they're asking questions about the federal arrangement, right? What is California getting out of a political system which so badly represents the interests of California in the national level, either by people or GDP contribution, and where California is, so dependent on this broken federal system to provide relief. So I have not heard, this is newly energized questions I'm getting from people who are not academics, and it's interesting, and I have to admit, frankly, concerning for me. But I do see hope, and the place where I see hope, and I was talking to a colleague of mine, Michael Tesler, who's an expert on public opinion, is that although the US political system doesn't seem to be functioning well in the crisis, public seems to be moving in an interesting direction. And you're gonna have a colleague of mine, again, Sarah Goodman, come on in a few weeks to talk about dimensions of this research. But what we're seeing is that first, public opinion favors competence in the management of these programs. It's actually one of the puzzles for why the administration chose to be so delayed in the gathering crisis, because political science researchers showed that presidents and governors who move aggressively to respond to crises get rewarded in public opinion. Mishandling crises, you get punished. If a president mishandles a crisis and governors do well, research has shown that the governors are rewarded. So public opinion is demanding competence from our government, and we're seeing that actually grow. So large majorities of Americans, including Republican voters who we would expect would be most responsive to the president's messages, continue to support the lockdown orders. They continue to have faith and demonstrate public opinion support for policy experts. And in fact, a recent set of public opinion surveys I showed of the American voter show that there's an increasing appetite for mainstream media information that's giving less politicized coverage of the media. And with that same trend in public opinion, we see that American voters are actually favoring technocratic policymakers, those who seem to dispassionately be handling problems rather than politicizing them. So why do I say there's hope? Well, there's hope that the American voter is going to demand sober policy competence moving forward. And in so doing, that will provide the correction to our system. Do I think that's optimistic? I do, but it's the hope.
Just a quick thing that's more of an announcement that's come in, which is that next quarter, Professor Li Zhang in Global and International Studies will be teaching a course on global pandemics. Oh, sorry, excuse me, next spring quarter. So a year from now. So Graeme, if you keep teaching your class, then, Professor Zhang can just like pick it up in the spring. But for those who are interested, take a look. There's a question.
One of the things I explain to my students is there are weeks that they're not going to want to think about COVID. And fortunately, the syllabus allows them to read theories of policy without engaging COVID whatsoever. By and large, the students have actually seemed to think this is very helpful. It gives them a way of neutrally looking at things that are disrupting their lives. They've explained this to me, and I actually share that sentiment. But man, what a grim spring quarter that would be. Global pandemics, the continuing politics of COVID. I'm in. I'm completely prepared for this eventuality.
Actually, there was a question that I was going to hold for the end, but I think given what you just said about the students, I think I'm going to give this one to you now. And this comes from Evan, who wants to know, what's the tone of the students? What's the mood of the students? Are they fearful? Where are they at?
They're in their apartments and houses. Some like me dealing with small children bombing across the room, right? We started our class by talking about how we're getting, takeout and food delivered. We actually talk about how we're going through this on the days. And I have students who are differently affected by this, and it's really poignant. So by and large, the student tone and attitude is extremely professional. These are future, these are students who are largely in their second year of a 2-year MPP program and stepping into the field next year. And if, first of all, if you're hiring, please contact me. These are outstanding students. And they're approaching this with that level of professionalism that they're going to need as future policy leaders in the field. And I mean that. They're reading it critically. They're challenging me about the questions and largely finding this a useful way of organizing the crisis, understanding it, and then applying it to advance their own research. Now, I have a student whose father is a police officer in Detroit. He's on patrol in a city that's in the epicenter of one of the hotspots, and who has colleagues who are falling victim to COVID. And again, this student cycles between finding it a way of thinking helpfully about how municipal governments can, her research focuses at times on how municipal governments are differentially responding to the needs of first responders as we manage this crisis. And that's useful. And there's other days when she says, Graeme, I really just wanted some space from this time. And so we're seeing at a personal level how this is impacting our students by extension, through the lives of their families. It's hard to watch. We listen, and usually there's some really powerful insights in this. One of the things in my teaching and research career, and I'm trying to do even more of, is ground the type of work I do, which is often very quantitative, technically oriented, political science about policymaking, but grounded in the reporting coming from the media, the experiences of our politicians, and the narratives of people who are living through a crisis like this one. So I find it's very motivating for us as a class to continue what I think is pretty important work.
Thanks. No, great response to a really great question. I think, when I'm talking to other people, it's so hard to know what words to use when you want to say, like, when I'm talking to people around the country, because I'm talking to them in Zoom, right here in the same spot. But you know what I mean. When I'm talking to people in various places, our alums, some of our community members, they all want to know, like, how are the students doing? They want that check-in. And from my perspective as dean, most of what I'm hearing is, some expressions of concern about, what will the job market look like for them if they're graduating, but overwhelmingly what I'm getting is expressions of gratitude for the fact that, we transitioned to remote instruction, it's mostly working okay, and it gives people that structure in their lives that just helps them manage right now. But I've got to, go ahead.
Can I broaden this discussion? I also am teaching a class of 400. I moved a giant lecture of Introduction to American Politics online, and my students have been part of a COVID diaspora. I have students who've been returning home to Europe that were visiting exchange students. I have students that have returned home to China. I have students who live on campus, and when I take my kids down for a bike ride through Aldrich Park, I feel about what a strange experience it is for these students who are living as the last students on the dorms to step out into a campus that's typically vibrant, and now it's empty and they're asked to avoid other people, right? This is a hard hand that they're dealing with extremely well. And, we've had to make accommodations as professors to deliver, I can be a hard professor. I tell my students on the first day of Intro to American, don't approach me asking me to loosen the readings. You're at one of the best public universities and one of the best systems on earth. Don't approach me and ask me to tone it down, on the first day of class. And yet we also have to be aware of what they're dealing with. So I've had students who are in quarantine. They're in China. They've been spending 14 days unable to access the internet, right, reliably. And what, if your student's in the room and you've been reluctant to ask your professors, I would encourage you to do so, because what I tell these students is reach out to me and the TA and we'll work out an accommodation. That accommodation may be that we won't require you to submit those assignments from those 2 weeks because I don't want you to fall behind as you do the remainder of it. Or, as I had a really inspiring student yesterday tell me, Professor Boushey, please allow me to turn in this work. My battery collapsed, but I'm really learning so much from doing it. So, I told him, okay, if you can voice type on your iPhone, which is what he's trying to do, and you want to submit it, like, by all means, like, but I hope that's a choice you're making for your education, and I'll work with you if things get more difficult. So sorry, Bill, I was part of a faculty meeting, yes, on Wednesday, where 30 political scientists talked in depth about how we are delivering the education we want to, the rigorous, extraordinary education, while helping our students through these times. And I want you to know your professors are attentive, they care, and you students are inspiring to us. It really is a joy to teach on my laptop on my porch because I have these students, right? I'm serious.
Thanks, Graeme. You're gonna make me cry, but I love hearing that. Let me give you one last one, and I apologize to Joshua, Robert, Victor, for not getting to your other questions in here. And also a shout out to your colleague, Sam Vortherms, who is teaching politics around the world in the fall and will be developing coronavirus-based elements for each unit. So there'll be a comparative politics class in the fall with coronavirus in it. But here's the last question comes from Erica Vogel, who's an alum who received her PhD from here a number of years ago. And well, first she says, does Biden have a chance? But you don't have to answer that. The question really is, how might a change in administration change the direction of our response to the pandemic? Or do you think that, it's pretty much the same stuff, folks in the same agencies who are going to be dealing with it? What would a change of administration bring?
That's the great question, right? And we're going to have a lot of research come out of this because we have, at the state level, 50 executives handling this differently, right? We're all wondering, what if a different presidential administration had been confronted with this problem? Biden sure has a chance for re-election, but I'm answering that as looking at the polling numbers as a political scientist. In the swing states that Trump depends on, the public opinion support for Trump is dipped. The elderly population that ostensibly would deliver a winning coalition to Trump are supportive of Biden's candidacy. It's currently, many of the people, I'm not an expert on elections, many of the people continue to describe as a toss-up, but a toss-up certainly involves a chance for Biden. I'll leave you to decide how you feel about that. But you asked the question that I think is really important, and I thank you for doing it, because it's going to get to what I want to emphasize for my students and for people listening. We're going to face a challenge of administration. It's not that we don't have competent people ready to handle this problem, but unfortunately, we've had flight from the federal bureaucracy. We've had experts who are equipped and qualified to manage these programs well leave, either in response to the indifference of the current administration to their work in managing problems in agencies as diverse as education, agriculture, the FDA. And the challenge that always faces a new presidential administration is, how do you assume control of the bureaucracy? But for whatever president follows this one, there's going to be the additional challenge of repopulating that bureaucracy with experts. I had my colleague who's an expert on the bureaucracy, speculated that if he were California or Washington or Oregon right now, he would be hiring, because we have these career civil servants from the federal bureaucracy who are departing, and he already sees a California that has a expert bureaucracy that may now exceed the expertise, or at least be compensating for the expertise in the federal bureaucracy. So the challenge for Biden, and again, I'll refer you back to Michael Lewis's work on the fifth risk, or I can give you academic sources if you continue to be interested. But the challenge is repopulating a bureaucracy that isn't a deep state. It's not, it's difficult. We know presidents face challenges in how they control their bureaucrats, but they're also essential for identifying emerging crises. And I hate to tell you guys that coronavirus is only an example of one of the many crises our bureaucracy is meant to manage and prevent from occurring. And it's a weakened bureaucracy. But we have this bureaucracy that's meant to, provide information to us and our elected officials and manage these programs in order to prevent the worst case scenarios. And the challenge for the next president, whoever they are, is to repopulate it with those people who dedicated their careers to work across administrations to provide the best information to a democratic government to act upon.
Well, we're just about out of time. A number of other questions have come in, as well as expressions of gratitude. People are interested in seeing your syllabus or your reading list. So is that available somewhere that folks can access, or should
I would be interested in learning from other professors how they do their syllabi. What I do is I just start hemorrhaging citations. So my syllabus is 21 pages long, and on my syllabus I have a note to my graduate students don't freak out, we're going to reduce the readings part each week based on where we want to go. But yes, I have a 21-page annotated syllabus with popular media readings that are attached to cases. And I would love to teach a class like this at the undergraduate level. I don't know if I have the flexibility to do so. That's a conversation for powers that I'm talking to right now. But yeah, this is a conversation that I would dearly love to continue to all of this, but hopefully in person from a safe distance someday.
Well, Graeme, can you post it on your website? Can people find it there? Or
oh, yeah, that's a great idea. I've moved. Canvas is my world now. So, but unfortunately Canvas is limited to my students. So yeah, I'll just post it up.
That'd be awesome. Great. I think a lot of people would appreciate that.
And Bill, if you want to copy and paste questions that people had, I can see if I can respond to any of them.
I don't know if I know how. So what I'll do first is thank you so very much for doing this morning, for sharing your expertise, for sharing a little bit about what you've been doing in the class and your thoughts on the policy response to COVID-19 in specific and in general terms. We really, really appreciate what you're doing for the students, as well as what you've done for us all here today. I also want to thank Andy Hill, who's been in the background from Social Sciences Computing Services, helping this all work smoothly. And maybe Andy knows how to capture the questions, so you can take a look at the other questions later on. And for everyone who joined us here today, thank you so much for coming. There will be more of these. We've been announcing them in dribs and drabs, but if you go to the social sciences website, socsci.uci.edu, you'll see a whole list of this particular series, our Zeries, as well as other events and programming that we are providing. So I hope to see you all again soon. Graeme has one last word.
Zot, zot.
Oh yeah, zot, zot, zot. Nice. And look, see, I have my little mug with my anteater, trying to have some spirit on a Friday.
A real privilege to everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.